I'm a registered nurse. I'm not well versed in all aspects of petroleum development, but I am an expert in health and environmental health. I have had the privilege to study with the American Academy of Environmental Medicine and to provide care to many Nova Scotians who are sick because of exposure to chemicals and environmental toxins. And I know that hydraulic fracturing makes people sick. It's so hard. I'm thinking of some of the people that I have cared for whose lives have been permanently changed. So just bear with me. Some people get sick quickly, some slowly, some over years. Some with manageable problems, some with disastrous, life-altering, long-term health problems, and everything in between. I don't think this, or believe this, or understand that there's some controversy about the possible health effects of fracturing. I know this. Hydraulic fracturing makes people sick. They develop dementia-like conditions. They experience fatigue like that of those with chronic fatigue syndrome, exhausted body and brains that are not restored with rest and sleep. They develop depression and anxiety disorders. They experience lung damage that is not reversible. They have the inside of their nose cauterized, burned to stop severe, frequent nosebleeds. I would propose that these costs, I can't balance them out against the risks. Informed consent to chemical exposure is really important here. I think in some ways it's similar to deciding whether or not to take a drug with dangerous side effects. A problem here, though, is no one can control the dose administered, the route by which it is administered, and who it should never be prescribed for. I'm a logical person who works with the scientific process to guide my practice. I ask that the members of the review panel accept my respectful feedback. I sincerely appreciate your attentions on the behalf of our province's people. I appreciate your expertise in your own fields and your time given generously on our behalf. With regard to connecting with communities and looking at risks and benefits and permission to proceed, we need to be careful as to how we define community. The long arm of non-conventional wealth reach far. We must make sure that we are buying jobs that make people sick. As a registered nurse, I know that informed choice is really important, and I believe that we don't need shell gas at this cost. I must submit to you and those to whom you will report that enough of the review process seems flawed and therefore cannot result in a lifting of the current moratorium. I thank you for your efforts thus far. I also must thank you for doing whatever review panels do in a situation like this by having the courage, wisdom, and farsightedness to recommend that the moratorium continue or that a ban is put in place.
So I was going to go on to say that, from the health perspective, the important question is what is there a risk? And clearly there is a risk with hydraulic fracking because we are using chemicals. If it ever does proceed in Nova Scotia, chemicals will be used. So we have to ask the question, well, to what extent can they get into humans, can they impact on human health, and what, if any, are the mitigating measures which could be put in place to achieve that, to prevent human harm. And the two key recommendations which you will have seen them in the draft report and in the final report are that we simply don't know enough, and we need to build the evidence base as we go. We don't know enough about the baseline exposure of people to many of these chemicals, so we need better baseline environmental health monitoring.
Well, then why do it in the first place?
We don't know enough about health outcomes, and so we need better health monitoring systems. And what we're recommending, and again, we start from a position of entirely, as David says, of entire neutrality. If fracking ever did take place in here, we would need to see very, very robust environmental health monitoring.
Hi. Hello, is it on? My name is Tom Beck. I'm a professor here in the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science. I just want to begin by thanking you all for coming here today to talk to us. I think that dialogue is obviously crucial to the whole democratic process. That being said, there clearly isn't a whole lot of trust in this room. And I think there are very, very good reasons for that. I think we should reflect on them, and I think the committee should reflect on them and comment on them in the recommendations. We know, for example, that climate change is perhaps the most pressing problem that the world faces today. It's the most pressing problem the world faces today, and yet we don't have what anyone would call good faith efforts to try and combat that climate change in this country. That needs to change. People have a very real sense that their future is being stolen from them. And it's a very reasonable sense for them to have. And I think it's very important for your committee to reflect on that and comment on ways that trust can be reestablished with the community. Okay? Now, there are a couple of specific things in your presentation here that caught my attention and caused me some concern. And I hope you can say something about these. First of all, there was the notion that we need community permission if something like this was to proceed. And that all sounds very good, right? I mean, sure, of course, we want the permission of communities. But in itself, that can be very problematic as well. Because when something inevitably goes wrong, it's not going to be that community that is going to bear the risk. It's going to be this entire province that is going to bear the risk. Okay? We're going to be responsible for the inevitable lawsuits and cleanup that's required. Okay? So I think that we have to expand our notion of community permission. Community is really the entire province of Nova Scotia, when we are the ones bearing the risk. So that was one of my
Faster and shorter.
I'll wrap up my comments really quickly here. There was one other point. So community risk is one of the issues. The other issue is this notion of rigorous environmental risk assessments. Well, I think that at least two of you well know that for the past 3 years I've been hot on our government's heels about the cut to environmental monitoring activities that Environment Canada and the no longer have the scientific capacity to conduct the kind of rigorous assessments and monitoring that you're talking about. Okay? So this is a very, very serious consideration. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the province of Nova Scotia doesn't have it. Okay? And nationally, our environmental monitoring and assessment capabilities have been massively degraded. And I don't see how something like this could ever proceed without these capabilities being restored. It would be far, far too risky.
What we would have to do, as Tom points out, is to develop capacity and capability to conduct appropriate HIAs and EIAs for our purposes here in this province. That would have to be a precondition. So that is a point very well made. On the question of community risk, and I agree with what you're saying, Tom, that there are some costs that would fall to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia if anything horrible happened. But most of the direct costs in most of the scenarios that might emerge would be borne by the regional economy, by the local communities. So we've emphasised that, whilst also understanding, of course, that permission to proceed would be a complex thing. And indeed, it's been pointed out in meetings when we've been floating that idea thus far that there is no guarantee that provincial government might be elected that had an absolute disinterest in community attitudes and that they wanted to crash this thing through regardless. I don't think that would happen in our province. But there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee. And so what Constance McIntosh is doing, who's in Dow Law and is a member of our panel, is working through what would be the processes to bring life to the notion of community permission to proceed, relating it to the Environmental Goals of the Sustainable Prosperity Act and other tests. There's also a whole other set of tests which is to do with Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, and Aboriginal law and title. We can talk about that because Constance has written a very, very detailed paper on that, and her analysis has only been further reinforced by the recent Supreme Court decision on BC. So Constance is currently working up what it would mean in terms of how you would establish that community permission to proceed and function, but also then relate that to the broader point we're making about the province as a whole.
So my question to you is hopefully going to be a very simple one to answer. As it stands right now, I understand your opinions are going to be continually growing and evolving. But as your opinion stands right now, would you encourage the continuation of the moratorium? Would you recommend that? Or would you recommend a ban, or would you recommend just let her go?
The view I think we've taken up to now is that is actually a political call. And it's not our job to do the role of the government to make that political call. But it is important for citizens to make sure, through your MLAs, through your councillors, through other mechanisms, that when our report does hit the streets, when it's with government, you make very clear to government what is your view of what that might mean in those kinds of public policy terms.
I know it's hard to give a definite answer, but would you personally support a moratorium or not? You don't have to say.
As chair of this panel, I'm not taking a stance.
My name is Alexandra Vance, and I'm a marine conservation specialist here at Halifax University, working in part with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I recently finished my graduate studies here at Dalhousie and a master's in marine management, and as part of my training, I have been taught to try to reconnect the policy, science, and public interface. And so I do appreciate that we're all here today trying to do so. I would just like to make mention, though, as I suppose a self-proclaimed academic, that there are a number of studies that appear to have been exempt from the review process. In part, looking at the exposed animal risk, there are already a number of reports that have found cases of illnesses, death, and reproductive issues in cows, horses, goats, lambs, chickens, dogs, cats, fish, and other wildlife, including humans.
You're here.
And I propose that the only way to be proactive, as you have insinuated, is to enact the precautionary principle by monitoring in advance of having these seismic testings, as is quite renowned in most conservation sectors, that we need to improve the monitoring routes of exposure, including water, soil, and air, which in your review, you've only discussed water, so I'm concerned a little bit about where where soil and air falls into place. But to do so prior to drilling and at regular intervals after drilling is completed, and disclosing fully the chemicals used when hydrofracking. And also, we need to protect key habitats and critical lands, as well as waterways. Again, we are looking, you've mentioned at water, but I want to ask, are we only looking at fresh water that people consume through their wells, or are we also going to entice the marine ecosystem, from which completely surrounds Nova Scotia?
On the issues of land use and so on and so forth, that's exactly what would come out of EIA's properly designed, the monitoring that's already been assessed. There are also, again, I've raised this already, there are also fundamental questions that have to be posed around Aboriginal title and treaty rights that absolutely impact on those kinds of natural environmental topics. The only thing I would take slight issue with you on is your interpretation that we're assuming this will go ahead. The first thing we said, the main thing perhaps that we are saying, is that we are not saying this activity should proceed now, nor are we saying it should necessarily proceed in the future. So that is the position of the panel.